Christ said that a man must lose his life in order to gain it, and that when a man attains the kingdom of heaven, all else shall be added to him. This represents two successive stages: first contraction of the ego to nothingness and then infinite expansion. But in actual practice the two processes are seldom so clearly divided. The adding and subtraction or expansion and squeezing go on side by side, and that is the trouble. An aspirant may go through alternate phases of expansion, when grace floods his heart and the quest is a lilt of beauty, and contraction when he seems to have lost everything and be squeezed to the bones, when all is dryness and he is tempted to despond and can do nothing but grit his teeth and hold on with grim perseverance. But there is also the danger that the process of expansion may take the form of new powers and perceptions on the subtle plane, which is likely to seduce him from his path, as Circe or the Lotus Eaters did the comrades of Odysseus. Like Circe, they may also turn their victims into swine. A true guru will encourage no such things. Let them come after. 41 The kingdom of heaven has been attained, as Christ said. The Maharshi cautioned that even when powers come unsought they should not be accepted. They are like a rope to tether a horse. Indeed, reference to them as a goal or reward of the quest is always a suspicious sign in a guru. Even without full knowledge, the ego has a premonition of the delicious fruits dangling on the trees ahead. It is also a premonition of its own impending sacrifice. The premonition of expansion explains the many who are called and the queer company they are. The need for contraction explains the few that are chosen. The combination of the two processes explains the nervous tension that is often set up when, instead of complementary, they become opposing forces. It is no play acting and no easy task. There will be no success until the ego is prepared to surrender and go to its own sacrifice, but on the way it may pass the trees I referred to, dangling with tempting but unearned fruits. The conflict between the two tendencies may be enough to overbalance the mind. I have seen such cases, and at the least this kind of madness is always egoism pushed beyond the limits. The question who can understand the supreme goal and dedicate his life to its quest is, of course, not the same as the question who can read Gwenin. At first I thought it was. In fact, I divided mankind quite simply into those who had read and understood Gwenin and those who had not. Actually, of course, there are people who can approach the truth but not through that gateway. I was driven to recognize this because my wife was one such. I never for a moment doubted her ability to understand, and I was therefore dismayed when she would not read Gwenin. She simply said that she could not read a whole chapter about what could be said in a few 42 sentences. Although I did not appreciate it, she was of a more intuitive type, more the artist and less the scholar. Perhaps women in general tend to be, but one cannot generalize too far in this matter. I have known women who come to the path through Gwenin and men who have needed a more direct or intuitive approach. In any case, my wife followed mainly through my explanations but without full conviction or wholehearted dedication. Only later, when she came to the Maharshi, the sheer power of his presence, the grace and beauty that shone in him, a single prolonged gaze from his resplendent eyes, was enough to remove all doubt, with no word spoken. Thenceforth she was as devoted as any. There also she found books which really did say things in a sentence, books such as the Avadbhuta Gita and the poems of Thyamanavar, and became proficient in theory also until she could distinguish true teaching from false as clearly as any follower of Gwenin. As for me, I flung myself ravenously on Gwenin's books. I subscribed to the French monthly in which he wrote and also obtained all the back numbers that were available. I devoured whatever books I could lay hands on, either in English or French, dealing with mysticism, esotericism, symbolism, no matter of what religion. Not only did I read but study. I kept an alphabetical card index on my writing desk, as my tutors had done at Oxford, with a card for each name, theme or subject, noting down allusions, references and information as I read. According to strict Gwenin theory, I am not right in saying that the quest began for me at this time, because he taught that it begins with initiation, and he himself was not a guru and did not give initiation. Nevertheless, I am convinced that some spiritual influence flowed from him to those who read his books and redirected their lives accordingly. In any case, the mere fact 43 of changing from an aimless, dissatisfied life to one directed consciously towards the supreme goal was bound to make an enormous difference. Egoistical thoughts and actions might continue, but they were disapproved of. There was a constant struggle against them. A series of symbolical dreams bore witness to the inner change that was taking place. First there was a rectification of what the psychologists call the flight from fear, although I had not yet heard of it. The recollection came to me that in boyhood I had sometimes had dreams, not the same recurrent dream, which had threatened to turn into nightmare, but had avoided the frightening part by waking up. I felt that this had been the beginning of my loss of integrity and that I must go back into them and see them through to the end. When I determined to do so, I found, to my surprise, that there was in fact nothing very terrible. It was only the determination that was needed. After that there were other symbolical dreams, such as a person gets at an important turning point in his life. Some of them brought before me the realization that the first stage of my route was a return to the comparative integrity of Oxford. A person's whole life is a path he treads, leading to the ordained end. If at some point it becomes consciously so, that is the great blessing which makes achievement at least an envisaged goal. In my case, before that could happen, I had to come down to the nadir, to an inner destitution where all hope seemed to have failed and all values become hollow. Not a state of spiritual poverty, because there was no humility in it, nor of financial poverty, but of what might be called enforced poverty of life. The moment I reached the nadir, grace was manifested in a form making reascent possible, but this happened in 2 stages. To prevent my rushing onward to disintegration came 44. My marriage, a foreshadowing of divine grace, with its recall to happiness, integrity and aspiration and a return to professional work. However, even such an influence was too weak to arrest the trend, with the result that the current was flowing both ways, reascent and continued descent, a new purpose in life and an inner bankruptcy and lack of purpose, until grace was manifested anew with my discovery of Gwenon. If that was the first act in the drama of the quest, my marriage was the prologue to it. 8 adventures on the path, a small group of us came to Gwenon at the same time. I think the others were all younger than myself and all unmarried. I was to meet one and another of them under various circumstances on the path, but at the time I knew only Martin, or had just met 2 others as visitors to him. He, I think, knew them all. I do not mean a group in any organic sense, for that we never were. The only grouping Gwenon would have approved of was that of guru and disciples. Just a number of people who were drawn from the circumference towards the center at the same time and in the same way. Read with understanding. Mallory's Morte d'Arthur is a very sad story. The whole noble company of knights were gathered together at Arthur's court for the feast of Pentecost, and while they were seated at the round table the Sangreal passed through the hall on a beam of light, but veiled so that none actually saw it. They were asked who would undertake its quest, and all alike pledged themselves and rode forthwith. 46. Courage and high hope. Some, however, soon turned back, finding the tug of the world too strong. Some perished by the way. Some were daunted or overthrown by the dragons of the ego. Some bewitched or cast into dungeons by enchanters, the false guides who beset the path. Some turned aside to lesser adventures or sailed down in castles along the way. Some attained a single vision of the Sangreal and recognized that, for them, that was sufficient achievement for this lifetime, and out of all that noble company only 3 pursued the quest to the end. Gwenon had said that the only thing to be done was to find a guru, in any religion, who had both horizontal and vertical authenticity, that is to say who was both the validly appointed successor to an initiatic chain and a realized man, and to seek initiation and guidance from him. Therefore it was a matter of mere expedience to us what religion we joined. It simply depended where we could find a guru, an easy matter, we thought then, in our simplicity. However, he had also said he had failed to find any Christian organization which still combined full theoretical understanding with spiritual potency, and therefore we decided that it would be necessary to look farther afield. Technically he may have been right, and certainly my earlier failure to find an opening in Christianity inclined me to accept his verdict. However, it may be possible to attach too much importance to technical considerations in spiritual life and not enough to the grace that bloweth where it listeth. Later I was to come upon evidence of spiritual currents in the Christian West, some of whose representatives seemed by no means inferior in power and understanding to Westerners who had transplanted themselves to Eastern religions. Nor were such signs of life confined to the Catholic Church, to which alone Gwenon would allow some. 47. Technical legitimacy. In view of this, it does not seem absolutely necessary for Western aspirants in general to seek a path outside their ancestral religion, and even less so to take on themselves the burden of a foreign orthodoxy. It is, moreover, to be remembered that the spiritual power of any religion or church is not a fixed quantum but a living, vibrating force, continually radiating with greater or less intensity, attaining an incandescent heat or cooling down and growing inert, according to the fervor and sincerity and understanding of those within its orbit. And since every thought, every action, every aspiration has its repercussions, those who draw sustenance from a spiritual body thereby also increase its potency, while the reverse is also true, but those who devote their lives to its services, asking no reward, thereby draw sustenance. Some undoubtedly will be drawn to an Eastern religion or to the formless path of self-enquiry which will be described later in this book, and this cannot be considered regrettable. The characteristic of our age being the mutual acquaintance of doctrines and paths which had previously remained isolated, it is a good thing that those of the East should have representatives in the West to temper the obtuseness and smug superiority to which the Western intellect is so prone. On a more profound level also, the existence of various spiritual currents side by side cannot but increase the present fermentation and renewal of spiritual life. For this is a time of renewal. Even more, it is a time of division between those who have completely rejected the mild religious restraints of their ancestors and those who seek something more vital with fuller understanding and stronger purpose. And about myself, if I had learned of the life and testimony of the Christian mystics and came upon their modern followers when I was searching so vainly at Oxford, should I have found 48 a home there and avoided the 10 barren, wasteful years that were to follow before I discovered Gwenon? Such a hypothetical question is always unreal, since things could not really have happened otherwise than they did. Certain it is that it was only Gwynon's mode of expression which could fully satisfy my intellect, and, much as I revere the beauty and profundity of the various paths, Christian, Islamic and others, only the quintessential doctrine of non-duality and the Maharshi's path of self-enquiry based upon it corresponded with my needs and temperament and offered me perfect fulfillment. Moreover, people's destinies are so interwoven as to make any might have been illusory. If I had found an opening in England, I should not have drifted to Poland and therefore not to have met my wife and snatched her, from the chaos that Europe was to become, to Arunachala, at the feet of the Maharshi, where she also was to find the only fulfillment this life could offer. At that time, however, I, like the others of our group, took Gwynen's verdict unquestioning and simply presumed that it was necessary to abandon Christianity and seek farther afield. I could not avoid a feeling of regret that, whereas the others were all free to go to the East in search of a guru, being unmarried and for the most part, sufficiently well-to-do, I had no prospect of leaving Europe. However, as it turned out, within a year I was in the East while many or most of them were still in the West. A person's destiny is not an accident. It is not something extraneous to him. From one point of view it is the outcome of his thoughts and actions, an inevitable, automatic system of repercussions which can be called reward and retribution, and from another point of view the milieu necessary for his development. What obscures this from sight is the wrong habit. 49 of considering worldly happiness or prosperity the purpose of life, whereas it may often happen that the reverse is what a man's development needs. It is understandable, therefore, that once a man has recognized self-realization as his conscious goal and turned in that direction, his destiny should become more recognizably beneficent and meaningful, even though it may involve hardship. After 4 years at the Maritime College I left Poland for Bangkok where I took up the post of lecturer in English at the Chulalongkorn University. Having taken a degree in one subject and drifted into teaching of another created difficulties in my academic career. This proved a blessing in disguise in our case as it prevented us from being caught up by the Nazis in Poland a few years later or by the Communists in Lithuania. In one way or another all the members of our little group were brought safely through the war. The lower reality of events does not condition but subserves the higher reality of the quest. That does not mean that no one who has dedicated himself to the quest can die before its conclusion, but that his worldly success or failure, prosperity or privation, even life or death, will be such as his progress on the quest demands. I liked Siam, as I had liked Oxford. I liked the Siamese, a cheerful, easy-going, friendly people, and yet Siam was the second great wave of disappointment to me, as Oxford had been the first. I had built up a dream picture of Oxford which the reality could not substantiate. I had come to Siam imbued with Gwynen's descriptions of the traditional East, where political and social conditions subserve the spiritual discipline, where authority rests, openly or secretly, with the guardians of tradition, where the quest of realization is recognized as the goal and the purpose of life, and instead I found a nation 50 tumbling over itself to acquire the materialist civilization which I was trying to discard, and flinging away with both hands that to which I had dedicated my life, turning their back on it, trying to forget that it had ever existed. I had already known one Siamese, Seni Pramaj, a great nephew of King Chulalongkorn, after whom the university was called, who was Siamese minister in Washington during the Second World War and prime minister after the war. He had been Denzel Batchelor's roommate at Oxford. He was a dapper, practical little man whose great interest in life was tennis, and he thought Denzel and I mad for our preoccupation with poetry and ideas. He was typical of his people. Even before the quest started I had found kindred souls in England opposed to modern civilization with its materialist values, its divorce from nature, its rush and noise and superficiality. But when I got to Poland I found the viewpoint of Eastern Europe was quite different. Their modernism and industrialization still had a glamour. The term of contempt for a slum, for anything dirty or old-fashioned, was Asia, while the national pride was a coal mine or a steel foundry. If I even mentioned my viewpoint I encountered the suspicion that I was the cunning Englishman who, having industrialization in his own country, was trying to beguile East Europeans into putting up with backwardness in theirs. I was to find the same spirit in the East. In fact, I was to find that it was in the West, among those surfeited with materialism, that the renewed search for spiritual meaning was arising, while the East was rushing headlong into modernism. I found that even the traditional arts and sciences, about which Gwenin wrote so much, were disappearing. The last generation of Siamese architects had refused to initiate apprentices, 51 saying that the age of tradition was ended. As a result, modern buildings in the Siamese style, such as the university in which I taught, were mere imitations planned by Italian architects. True, there were the Buddhist monasteries in Siam, and I might have made a more careful investigation of them, but so far as I could gather from talks with my students and colleagues there was no very potent spiritual current there. Yes, there had been a Buddhist monk in the north who was said to be very holy and many people had visited him, but he was dead now. No, there was no one else. Incidentally, I recently saw, as a sort of confirmation, on reading The Wheel of Life, the autobiography of my post-war successor at the university, John Blofeld, who was a Buddhist, that he found no living current in Siamese Buddhism but had to go to Sikkim to seek a guru. Gwenin's description of the East, I found, would have been idealized and doctrinaire even in an earlier age. Today it simply would not apply. We soon heard from Martin that he had taken up a post as English lecturer at Cairo University. Gwenin also was living at Cairo and Martin got to know him and gradually became a sort of unofficial secretary to him. Before long, Martin wrote to us that he had found a Muslim guru, approved of by Gwenin, became a Muslim, and had been initiated by him. He also expressed the opinion that we should probably eventually be driven to join the same religion and even to follow the same guru. With Gwenin's approval, our group had undertaken the translation of his books, each selecting one. Martin was translating Orient et Occident and I its sequel, La Crise du Monde Moderne, which appealed to me as a beautiful, condensed, 52 and fundamental work. I finished the translation just before the war spread to the East, and I am told that Luzic published it under the title The Modern Crisis. I never saw a copy. I was cut off by the war at the time, and later I never troubled to get one. One of the benefits of this work was that it enabled us to correspond with Gwenin, who was very punctilious about the details of translation and about preserving his long sentences and careful system of punctuation. In the periodical for which he wrote, he had inserted an announcement that he could not answer personal letters or give advice or guidance. Perhaps this was necessary to avert a flood of correspondence in answering questions and explaining points of difficulty. I took advantage of this correspondence to tell him of the disappointment I had experienced from the contrast of the present reality of Siam with his idealized picture of the East, and it was partly as a result of my representation that he, or Martin Lings for him, explained in the English translation of Orient et Occident that Eastern countries of today do not correspond with his description of the traditional East. Such an explanation was, however, inadequate. The books should have been revised throughout to make it clear that it was not the East as it is that was being described but an ideal. Driven by impatience, I followed Martin's example in becoming a Muslim. In my case, however, this ran rather counter to Gwenin's injunction that one should first find a valid guru before making a change of religion. It might be said that I had indirectly found the one followed by Martin of whom I was told that Gwenin approved. However, especially in view of the war, there was no knowing how long it would be before I was able to approach him directly, and if I had meanwhile discovered 53 a Buddhist or Hindu or Taoist guru, it might have put me in an awkward position of having to change my religion a second time. Theoretically, if I required any emotional support before finding a valid guru, I should have sought it in the religion in which I had been brought up. In actual fact, however, it would have been hard to revive a jaded piety, whereas I did find immense support in Islam. In Bangkok, I appreciated the occasional evenings of Arabic song and incantation that my South Indian Muslim friends held in a large hall above a cloth merchant's offices. There is one of these that still rings in my head at times. In translation it would be, I ask pardon of God for what, in me, is not God, and all things say, God. The first phrase is an enunciation of pure non-duality, of the supreme identity, regarding all otherness, all separate individuality, or illusion of it, in oneself as a sin for which to ask forgiveness. This is, in its deepest sense, the sin of shirk, of associating any other with God, which is described in Islam as the one unforgivable sin, naturally, because when this is finally overcome there remains no other than God and therefore no sin or sinner to forgive. The second phrase describes the entire utterance of the name of God. And the men who spent their evenings in this manner were neither scholars nor men dedicated to the spiritual quest but simple merchants. It was amazing and very refreshing to feel the warmth and depth of their faith and to see the naturalness with which they regarded their religion as an absorbing reality and a constant topic of conversation, so unlike either the normal Western indifference or the truculent assertiveness often found in those who are religious. Here at last I was coming in contact with the traditional East, even though their standards may have fallen far short of what tradition demanded. Theoretically at 54 least they recognized the supreme goal, as the incantation translated above testifies. In practice they received initiation and followed a discipline though without full understanding or complete dedication. Even among them some of the younger generation were becoming lax both in life and worship. I began harmonizing my breathing with my pulse beat. With a little practice it is easy to feel one's pulse internally without putting one's finger on any spot, and harmonizing it with the breathing helps to rhythmatize one. When walking I kept my footsteps also to the same rhythm. To enhance the vibration it is very helpful to repeat silently a mantra, a ceaseless inner prayer attuned to the breathing and heartbeat like Arunachala Shiva or simply Om. In Islam one would repeat the Sababada, the Islamic confession of faith, silently, there is no God, while breathing out and, except God, while breathing in, so that every exhalation becomes a denial of the ego and every inhalation an assertion of the oneself. Years later I discovered from reading that this was a form of the ceaseless inner prayer, which in one form or another is practiced in all religions. Perhaps the best known illustration of it is the constant prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, also attuned to the breathing and heartbeat, used by an anonymous Russian pilgrim, as described in The Way of the Pilgrim. English translation by R.M. French, SPCK. It may not suit all wayfarers or every path. At that stage of the path it was most useful to me. It maintained a living spiritual rhythm and also helped to guard against sins of forgetfulness. There is no rigid barrier between the physical and spiritual. The spiritual current can be kept up during our daily activities as a sort of substratum, and then the work performed will not only not suffer but will go on more effectively because it will be 55 more spontaneous. Rhythmic movements during prayers, prostrations and rituals emphasize this, and one may feel intuitively the need to extend the rhythmization to the body also. Indeed, mental, moral and physical harmonization is the threefold basis of spiritual development. It is true that physical harmonization alone does not lead to spiritual growth, but neither does mental understanding alone nor moral rectitude alone. It is the combination of the three that is needed. On the direct path, total harmonization is produced spontaneously, and such disciplines leading to it can be ignored, but that was a path to which I had not yet been led. Early in 1939 news came that two of our group, who had been traveling about in India for some time, had at last found a guru. It is easy to remember the date, because it was less than a fortnight after the birth of our son that my summer vacation started, and my wife, knowing how much it meant to me, raised no objection to my going. As soon as I reached India, I had the peculiar feeling of being at home for the first time in my life. I had never felt really at home in England, but had always intended to make my living abroad. Neither had I felt at home in Poland or Siam. It was not that I preferred the Indians. Indeed, the gay cheerfulness of the Chinese shopkeepers in Bangkok was something I missed in the Indian shops. Nor were the parts of India I then visited particularly beautiful, dusty, sun-bleached plains, dilapidated villages, bleak, whitewashed houses. There was simply the indefinable feeling that I belonged here, that this was home. I stayed in a middle-class hotel in a hot, white-walled, dusty town through the worst of the summer heat.
A single story hotel, no funds, very cheap by European standards. I Sharita.
56 room with my two friends. I had not met them before, but they immediately became friends, companions on the quest. There is a hadith TB, a saying of the Prophet. There is no friendship but only companionship in Islam. At night we and our neighbors in the hotel took our beds out into the courtyard to sleep. The Indian sebarpoi, a light wooden framework with cord criss-crossed between it and a mattress only about an inch thick thrown over. I adapted myself easily, and here again I appreciated the atmosphere, mostly business and professional men, no women as far as I could see. Many of the men devotional, most of them imbued with pride of Islam. They never doubted that it was the finest of all religions. Naive? But does a Christian professor of comparative religion or a Buddhist abbot ever doubt that his is the finest religion? And is this not equally naive? However, on the contingent level of dogma and social application, the religions necessarily differ, like the sides of a mountain. Each represents a different viewpoint, and therefore each must seem best when seen from its own viewpoint, and from this viewpoint every other must seem either wrong or at best inferior. On the purely spiritual level, all religions are unanimous. They cannot be otherwise, since truth is one. It is like a mountain approached from different sides. The nature of the terrain differs on every side, and the paths run in different and even opposite directions, but the peak is one and they all converge on it. This is beginning to be widely appreciated nowadays, and there have been a number of books either expounding it or illustrating it by means of comparative quotations culled from the mystics of the various religions. What is needed is simply to attend to one's own religion. 57 are to see each from its own viewpoint. Throughout most of history, the former has been the preferable attitude. So long as one sincerely followed one's own religion, it was quite unnecessary to know about any other. The average Christian, for example, hardly knew that there was a religion called Buddhism, so why should he study it? Today, however, with the expansion of a uniform modernism over all the religions and over the previously diverse civilizations which they sponsored, such an attitude is rarely possible for the intelligent and inquiring. Too much is known about the existence and surface disagreements of other religions. Therefore, the second attitude becomes necessary for many people, to understand and explain each from its own viewpoint. Those who claim to be authorities on religion should facilitate this process, not obstruct it, as they so often do. Because if it is not done, the observer is faced with the dilemma that all the millions of followers of another religion affirm what his own denies and deny what it affirms. Simply to brush the problem aside by saying, "We are right and all the others are wrong," is too superficial an attitude to hold the intelligent student. As an example of what I mean by viewpoint, there is an able and learned book by F. H. Hilliard called The Buddha, the Prophet and the Christ, Allen and Unwin, which examines the views of their followers on the divinity of these three founders of religions. It is more fair-minded and impartial than most such books. Nevertheless, it must inevitably suggest the superiority of that religion which is based on belief in the divinity of the personal Savior, that is to say, Christianity. From the Islamic viewpoint, the essential comparison would be between the Quran, the Gospels and the Pali Canon, and the scales would come down in favor of the only one of the three religions. 58, which is based on a divinely revealed scripture, that is Islam. From a Buddhist viewpoint, it might be a comparison between the Noble Eightfold Path, Christ's injunctions to his followers in the Islamic Sharia, and Buddhism would come first as the only one of the three religions whose founder had himself laid down a clearly formulated path from suffering to beatitude, from ignorance to light, from samsara to nirvana. Obviously, then, a really useful and instructive comparison would be one which showed the equivalence of personal Savior, revealed scripture and clearly demarcated path. And such a study would not need to grade the religions but to simply indicate the different modes of approach. I was taken to see the Guru, or Murshid, in the cool cloister of an old stone house, looking out on a dusty courtyard. Phi kept me waiting a few minutes before entering. A short, broad man of about 60, white-haired, bearded and bright-eyed, with a brisk, alert manner and a look of keen intelligence. Phi was wearing a skullcap, gown and pajama trousers, all of gleaming white cotton, freshly laundered and ironed. It was always so that I saw him. Phi asked general questions about my life, my work, my circumstances, touching on nothing spiritual. I felt a strong wave of disappointment. I had no impression of spirituality but put it down to my lack of psychic receptivity. The spiritual power must be there or my friends would not have recognized it. One of them, after 2 years' ineffectual search, when he heard of this Murshid, had cancelled his ticket. The other had met Martin's guru but was more attracted to this one. Neither had any doubts. It was some days before I received initiation. One day, during this interval, I was alone in the hotel when 2 of our neighbors came across to speak with me, professional men of 59 about my age. After speaking about the pure doctrine of non-duality, which so many Indian Muslims, imbued with Sufi teachings, understand as clearly as Hindus, they suggested to me in a tactful way that I might not be very wise in my choice of a Murshid and showed me a pamphlet in English by their own. I was not impressed by it and disliked his transliterating his name in such a way as to make it look English. Nor did I approve of their proselytizing for a guru. I decided that rivalry was at the base of their warning and ignored it. In fact, I willed myself to believe in my Murshid just as I had willed myself to be tragically in love at Oxford. Simplicity and sincerity are seldom natural qualities, they have to be acquired. It was not into one Sufi order alone that I was initiated but into the group of great Indian Muslim orders, my Murshid being entitled to represent them all. The spiritual exercises I was given are such as are only revealed on initiation. There was, however, one meditation among them which there is no harm and some interest in speaking about. There is a verse in the Quran, "He is now as he was," and I was to meditate on the two in conjunction. If there was God alone and if he remains as he was, utterly unchanged, if the creation of the universe and all that it contains has not limited him in any way, has not touched even the fringe of his being, then all other than God is an appearance without intrinsic reality, he alone is the real. Therefore whatever is the essence or reality of me cannot be other than God. I cannot say, I am God, but I can say, I am not other than God. There is an enormous difference, for the former might deify the ego, the individual in me, while the latter denies its very existence. And when all the illusory other than God is denied, what remains? Only God, who is now as he was. 60. This is a good example of how the Sufi saints read the highest meaning into the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet. There have been Western scholars who have questioned their right to do so, maintaining that no such meaning was intended. This is preposterous. What it comes to is the implication that men whose whole lives are a quest for truth, some of whom have attained the supreme super-rational truth, have built their work on a foundation of error or falsification. Also that the founder of one of the world's great religions had himself not seen beyond the exoteric wall to the deeper meaning of his message. It is ignorance criticizing knowledge. People who do not understand the universal truth, even in theory, but look upon Sufism as a mere set of philosophical ideas may accept such a view, but not those who have understood that truth is one and universal. Why, then, is the truth of non-duality not explicitly taught in Islam, as it is in many Hindu and Buddhist texts? Why should it be necessary to seek it in hidden and symbolical sentences? A religion has to be adapted to an entire people, not only to a spiritual minority, and the type of adaptation required varies from the age and community. The various religious traditions teach that there is a process of diminishing spirituality in the history of mankind, and therefore the latest religion revealed has to be the most hard and exoteric in order to hold the masses, which means that its higher implications will be veiled in the most cryptic and symbolical form. That is the case with Islam. But how does belief in the existence of Sufism from the very origin of Islam, in fact as the very essence of Islam, fit in with the evidence which historians and philosophers profess to find of its gradual development and of the influence on it of Neoplatonism? There is no doubt that Neoplatonism did exert 61 an enormous influence on the formulation of Sufi philosophy. Modern philosophers could, therefore, hardly help regarding Sufi philosophy as a derivative of Neoplatonism once they made the initial error of considering it a philosophy at all. Of course it is not, it is a path, which is something quite different. Some of those who teach or follow a path may like to give a philosophical exposition of it, but there is no necessity to do so. Studying a philosophy is quite a different type of activity from following a path. Those philosophers who study Neoplatonic or Sufi philosophy today are not Sufis, are not even training to become Sufis, since they are not following a Sufi path, whereas I, on the other hand, when I set foot on the path, was not expected to study Neoplatonic or any other philosophy. No disciple of the Sufis is. A basic understanding of the theory of non-duality is expected, but that is simple, and after that practice, not theory, is needed. Even if the philosophers had never formulated their theories at all, if there were no other texts, no books, no theories, the basic meaning is contained entire in the Shahada itself. There is no God but God, and according to Islamic tradition this has been used with full understanding, as a weapon for fighting the greater holy war, from the beginning. It is the same as that tremendous sentence from the Bhagavad Gita. There is no existence of the unreal and no non-existence of the real. Whether philosophers write books about it or not, whether they agree with Plato or not, does not concern the spiritual wayfarer, whose task is not to theorize about it but to use it. I had not long returned to Bangkok before I received a letter from Martin saying that his guru had seen photographs of Mimers Bid and some letters written by him and was not happy about him, in fact did not consider him a realized man. 62 My wife had already formed such an opinion prior to this as soon as she heard my account of the guru and saw his picture. This started a general correspondence among those concerned that at times became acrimonious. Mimers Bid revealed a talent for abuse that embarrassed me. 2 more members of our original Gwenin group were able to come to India despite the war. They met him and were not impressed. Martin wrote reminding me of Gwenin's teaching that there were 2 grades of initiatic organization, that where the guru had only horizontal authenticity, that is to say valid appointment in succession to an unbroken chain of gurus, and that where he had vertical authenticity, also, that is direct connection, through realization, with the divine source of initiation. Initiation into the former should bestow a certain grace but could not lead to realization, for that the realized guru was necessary. This made a deep impression on me, for never at any time was I willing to relinquish pursuit of the supreme goal. I held out for a while, partly out of loyalty to Mimers Bid, but largely also from reluctance to admit that I was in the wrong, but eventually I gave in, convinced of my error. Years later I perceived how futile the whole dispute had been, when I appreciated at last the significance of the term realized man, and when I found that Martin's guru, whom I never met, was explaining that the guru need not be realized, while Martin himself was telling new aspirants that there was no hope of realization in this lifetime. This is not mere pessimism but a sinking to the exoteric level. It betokens a failure of the basic understanding of non-duality required for the quest, and therefore, on the spiritual level, it is an error. It is itself an impediment to realization, since it vests the unreal with a temporary reality by asking when and whether it can cease to 63 exist. Forgetting that there is no existence of the unreal and no non-existence of the real, it substitutes the exoteric fallacy that there is a temporary existence of the unreal, which may be replaced by the real on some future occasion. To put it quite simply, saying that you cannot attain realization in this lifetime means asserting what you should deny, the existence of a you, who can or cannot attain, and thereby closes the door to realization. The question whether you can attain or not ought not to arise, it ought to be dissolved in the real question. Who is it that seeks to attain? I did not grasp all this clearly at the time, but was quite determined not to remain on a path that did not lead to the goal. Was there any benefit from the initiation I had rushed so impatiently to acquire in all the exercises I had done? Such a question is not always easy to answer. A man is ill, he takes medicine and gets better, but is it because of the medicine or in spite of it or independently of it? There seemed to be an increased depth and subtlety of understanding after the first initiation and of spiritual vigor after the second. It may be said that there was benefit from the determination and enthusiasm that made me seek. So far as Mimers Bid goes, I was never really wholehearted, perhaps that was what made it comparatively easy for me to abandon him. Others have been less fortunate, becoming attached to gurus who are not merely incomplete, lacking self-realization, in that there is no harm so long as they recognize their limitation, but false and deluded, misguided and misguiding others. It is a sign of the times, the time of false Christs and false prophets of which Christ warned his followers. Some such are widely known and publicized, others almost unknown. They make the highest possible claims for themselves, or allow their disciples to make them. This one is Christ at his second coming, that one is God. 64 Incarnate. How far they are self-deluded and how far consciously deluding others is usually very hard to say. A man may spend years in solitude, practicing yogic discipline, as a result of which various powers may develop, both internal powers such as vision and audition, and outward directed powers such as telepathy and hypnotism. Then the ego, forgetting that its own immolation is the ultimate goal of the process, may pride itself on what it has acquired, regarding this as realization. In some cases this capital, accumulated during the time of training, may be gradually exhausted, like an overdrawn bank account, and the guru survives on his former reputation, if at all. But in other cases it may continue or even grow with the growth of the ego. For the ego will grow. There is no food on which it flourishes more than the adulation of disciples. The seeker needs to use great caution in estimating not only the guru but also the purity of his own motives, for any impure motive may be reflected outwardly in an imperfect guide. And then not only will he not be led forward into greater purity but will be infected by the imperfections of the guide, drifting into a worse state than before. For qualities of the ego are as infectious through psychic contact as a disease is through the physical. Sometime during my stay at Bangkok I stopped reading. I had read voraciously ever since first discovering Gwenin, but the time came when I felt, I know the theory now, it is practice that is needed. It was not just an option but also something deeper. I felt an actual aversion to the books which had so attracted me. This was a sound intuition. In almost all cases some doctrinal understanding is necessary at the beginning, and this needs to be more or less elaborate according to the temperament of the seeker and the nature of the path followed. From the beginning I was drawn to the direct path, which I will 65 describe in a later chapter. Because this is known as Jnana Marga or path of knowledge, some have supposed it to be more theoretical than other paths, but the opposite is true. What is meant by knowledge is not learning but direct intuitional understanding. In fact, the more direct a path is, the less theory it requires. It is the indirect paths, such as Hermeticism and Tantrism, that are based on elaborate theory. In any case, whatever the path followed, there is no benefit from learning and relearning once the mind is convinced. Not only does it not help, but also it is one of the ways in which the aspirant can be sidetracked, turning away from spiritual effort to the easier alternative of mental exertion. Not only individual seekers but communities also deteriorate in this way. Often the followers of unscholarly ecstatics become scholars, but it marks a spiritual decline. This is a mode of decline that is apt to be found in all religions, from the saint to the scholar. Apart from providing an easy alternative to spiritual effort, excessive study can actually do positive harm by breeding pride in one's learning. I have even seen people reading to enjoy the self-satisfaction of feeling that they understood better than the writer. The Maharshi was immensely learned, but he became so unintentionally and without valuing learning. Devotees brought him books to read so that he could expound them, and his memory was such that he retained whatever he read. But he warned against barren erudition. What use is the learning of those who do not seek to wipe out the letters of destiny from their brow, by enquiry? Whence is the birth of us who know the letters? They have sunk to the level of a gramophone. What else are they, O Arunachala? 66. It is those who are not learned who are saved rather than those whose ego has not yet subsided in spite of their learning. The unlearned are saved from the relentless grip of self-infatuation. They are saved from the malady of a myriad whirling thoughts and words. They are saved from running after mental wealth. It is from more than one evil that they are saved. The collected works of Ramana Maharshi by the unlearned. He means, of course, the simple-minded, not merely the ignorant, and by the learned, those who value and accumulate learning, not all who possess it. For some years after this I scarcely read a book. To read books of no spiritual value, travel, fiction, politics and so forth, would have been even more a turning aside from the quest, degrading it to the level of a hobby or a part-time activity or an activity among others, one aspect of life, instead of the goal and the purpose of life. Therefore I did not read at all. Does this mean that I was a fanatic? No more than a man climbing Everest is a fanatic for not indulging in violin practice at the same time. I was one-pointed, not fanatical, and not one-pointed enough, or the progress would have been greater. I never objected to reading in principle or tried to persuade others not to read, but I had an objective in life and did not want to distract my mind from it. The question has often been asked why men want to climb Everest, reach the North Pole, descend to the ocean's depths, tread the face of the moon, or in general attain the almost unattainable, and why they undergo all manner of hardships and face death in the attempt. The true answer is that all such cravings are blind physical reflections of man's innate urge to undertake the supreme quest for his lost homeland, for the utter freedom and perfect bliss of his true state. That is the real adventure, the well-nigh impassable road to the 67 unattainable goal. The least the adventurer who dares attempt it can do is to be one-pointed in his enterprise. It is no idle ramble. When I started reading again it was a different way and for a different reason, as I shall explain later. Early in 1941 my original contract with the Siamese, by now renamed, Thai, government lapsed and was replaced by a permanent one. Between the two I became eligible for 6 months home leave. If it had not been for the war we should probably have gone far enough west to seek initiation from Martin's guru, but under the circumstances this was impossible. It also proved unnecessary, because Martin wrote that his guru now had a delegate in India who was authorized to give initiation in his name. We had heard of the Maharshi by this time and had received some of his writings and some photographs of him, which made a tremendous impression on us. However, one of our original Gwenin group had been to Tiruvannamalai to investigate and had reported that the Maharshi was not a guru and did not give initiation or spiritual guidance. This report had been relayed to us and it made it seem not worthwhile going there. Of this more later. We were traveling now as a family of 5. We spent some time in Rawalpindi where we enjoyed the keen, invigorating air and the scent of pine trees, then up to Murree, a beautiful hill station, then on to Kashmir to meet the delegate. I was afraid to take a houseboat, as most visitors to Srinagar do, because the children were small and the 2 eldest like quicksilver, and we should have been constantly anxious that they would fall into the water. However, we were fortunate enough to get a rambling old house with a large garden stretching right down to the shore of one of the lakes. It was a delightful holiday. 68 When we arrived there were wild irises by the roadside and luscious red cherries in the shops. One kind of fruit and flowers succeeded another through the summer. The 2 eldest children were at a delightful age, Catherine 5 and Adam 2, only Frania was still too young to be very interesting. Catherine was as intelligent as she was lovely. Strangers would stop to ask who she was. When I tried to put her off by telling her that I would explain something when she was older, she would say, "All right, Daddy, but try now, and if I don't understand I'll tell you." She usually did understand. Adam was still enjoying the adventure of walking and talking. There was no question this time of recognizing a spiritual master because the delegate was not even supposed to be such. Some spiritual force seemed to be transmitted. There seemed to be an increase of vigor and power, as with the previous initiation there had been of subtlety. Copyright aid registered. Tribulation in September 1942, our long and beautiful Kashmir holiday came to an end. But where next? The Japanese had already occupied French Indochina, as it then was, and were adopting a belligerent tone. Thailand might well be the next on their list. The consulate had asked British civilians in Thailand to stay at their posts as a means of maintaining some influence there, and in fact had let it be known that they would be turned down if they enlisted. And in any case the life I was leading there seemed more in accordance with my nature, and therefore more conducive to the quest than campaigning. It was decided that I should go back while my wife stayed on in India with the 3 children. But where? She was between 2 worlds. She had also received initiation, but she was certainly not quite convinced about the path we adopted, and followed it more for my sake than her own. Once in Bangkok we had seen an exquisite little stone figure of the Buddha sitting cross-legged with the Naga, the 70-headed serpent, reared over him to give him shade, a figure of rare serenity. The price was very high, or so it seemed to us, so my wife persuaded the shopkeeper to lend us it for a week so that she could obtain some clay through our neighbor, an Italian professor of sculpture, and set to work. What she produced was far from the original, but it was nevertheless an impressive piece of work. Being caught by the love of sculpture, she made next a bust of me. This was really excellent, so we had a bronze cast of it made. Shortly before she was due to leave Thailand we received some photographs of the Maharshi, and here is the point of this digression. My wife immediately felt the impulse to make a sculpture of him. Perhaps this was the deciding consideration, because she was still far from certain how far the quest was genuine and how far it was all play acting. One of our original Gwenin group had a house at Tiruvannamalai, and when he invited her to spend the time of our separation there, she immediately thought of the sculpture and it seemed the perfect solution. Even socially it seemed ideal, the people there being neither modern in the sense of superficial nor traditional in the sense of obscurantist. We parted at Lahore railway station, my wife and children going on to Bombay in the south, I to Calcutta and Thailand. I spent my 35th birthday in Calcutta on my outward journey. I was to spend my 39th birthday there on the way back before I saw my wife or children again. Catherine was the first to see Bhagavan. She stepped into the hall where he used to sit, a small, beautiful child with curly gold hair, bearing a tray of fruit in her hands, the customary offering. Bhagavan pointed to the low table beside his couch where such offerings were placed, and she, misunderstanding, sat down on it herself, holding the tray in her lap. There was a 71 burst of laughter. She has given herself as an offering to Bhagavan, someone said. A day or two later my wife entered the hall and sat down. Immediately Bhagavan turned his luminous eyes on her in a gaze so concentrated that there was a vibration she could actually hear. She returned the gaze, losing all sense of time, the mind stilled, feeling like a bird caught by a snake, yet glad to be caught. An older devotee who watched told her that this was the silent initiation and that it had lasted about 15 minutes. Usually it was quite short, a minute or two. She wrote to me that all her doubts had vanished, her objections no longer mattered. The idea of making a sculpture had been put aside, it seemed presumptuous. She had complete faith. She knew now that the teaching was true and that nothing else mattered. The most beautiful face, she told me, looked commonplace beside him, even though his features were not good. His eyes had the innocence of a small child, together with unfathomable wisdom and immense love. For her this was the time of grace and wonder, as the first reading of Gwenin had been for me, only far more vivid, having the living master before her. She felt his power and guidance constantly. During the years of our separation, most of those 4 years with no news of one another, she did not worry, although by temperament prone to worrying. When offered a job she did not accept it, although by nature provident. The time to go out into the world would come later, this was the time to be with Bhagavan. Once, when she wanted to take leave of him before taking the children to the hills for the hot weather, she met him alone as he was returning from his daily walk on Arunachala and said to him, "Bhagavan, I understand that all I have to do is 72 to keep quiet and everything will be all right." And he confirmed it, his eyes shining with approval. He has been known to say, "Only keep quiet and I will do the rest." But how hard it is to keep the mind quiet. He was very gracious during these years both to her and the children. They would come and show him their toys and tell their secrets. At one of the big annual festivals his couch was roped round with a sort of fence to keep the crowds from pressing too close, and Adam scrambled through to tell him something. He laughed and said to the attendants, "See how much use your fence is." In general he avoided touching people or being touched by them, but each cool season when my wife brought the children back from the hills, he touched Frania the youngest at some time or other, and once he picked her up and carried her. He was always very gracious to her. My wife was receptive also to the spiritual power of Arunachala. Before even she knew that it was a sacred mountain, she dreamed one night of a terrific storm, when the thunder crashed overhead, The wind uprooted ancient trees and the rain beat down on the roof, that opened and revealed a majestic figure, its personification, who summoned her imperiously to the hill. Almost daily she walked there, feeling its power of love and protection. Much of her meditation she did on the hill. Lying on a sun-warmed rock one evening, she had a vision of the whole world with its cities and men drawn into her mouth as she inhaled. The Japanese entered Thailand on December 8, 1941. After a few minutes' token resistance, the Thais surrendered and became their allies. As I afterwards learned, they had previously asked for help from Singapore but had been told that they would have to help themselves. I think it was on December 7 that 73 the consulate sent word around advising us to leave the country. Certainly it was too late to do so. The few who tried were turned back before they reached the frontiers. Moreover, the banks were closed so that it was impossible to draw out money. In order to save the expenditure of manpower in creating a civilian administration and of the troops in holding down a conquered country, the Japanese decided to treat Thailand as a self-governing ally, and as a result their troops kept strict discipline and there were no atrocities, as there were in China and Malaya. I took a cycle rickshaw and went to the university, but there were Japanese officers and troops all over the place. In the university grounds I saw some officers with no trousers on, standing fishing in the klongs, the canals that run everywhere alongside the roads in Bangkok. It was impossible to resume duty, so I came back. After a day or two Europeans were placed under house arrest. Gradually they were rounded up and taken to an internment camp. My turn did not come till January 11th, one of the last. It was about time, because my salary had not been paid and I could not get out to cash a check. While communications were still open I had received a letter from my wife telling me that Catherine and Adam had gone to Bhagavan and asked him to bring me back safely, and he had smiled and nodded. From then on I never doubted that I should come out of it alive. There was also a letter from Catherine, one of the most moving I have ever received. Daddy, you will love Bhagavan. When he smiles everybody must be so happy. We were interned in the premises of the University of Political and Moral Sciences, not that in which I had taught. There were several long buildings on the bank of the river, a field big enough to play basketball, a gravel road running the 74 length of the camp. Some of the buildings were partitioned off into cubicles where the married couples and a few other fortunate ones enjoyed at least visual privacy, although every sound could be overheard. Most of us had beds in common dormitories, with a little floor space each, which we fenced off as best we could with our belongings. There was a large shed at the back where we set up stoves and did a little private cooking, although our regular meals were sent in. Also a shop where various articles from town made their appearance or could be ordered. After some time cash allowances began to be received through the Swiss consul. We were allowed to elect a camp committee and president to control the internal running of the camp. At first we were badly overcrowded, but after some time the Americans and Dutch and a few others were evacuated, and we ended up with not much more than 100. The Thai, always keeping in mind that our side might win the war and hold them responsible, refused to make the camp over to the Japanese, so there were no atrocities. Indeed, one of the main evils to contend with was boredom. Anyone who knew anything that others didn't started classes. Books were circulated. Amateur gardeners took over plots around the various buildings and made ornamental gardens. Towards the end, when victory and evacuation were visibly approaching, my garden became an excellent symbol to me of life in the world. I gave it daily care and had real interest in bringing it to perfection, while at the same time prepared to leave it at a moment's notice. We knew well enough that victory was approaching because a small group of internees had taken the risk of smuggling in a wireless set and were skillful enough to keep it from the notice not only of the authorities but the rest of the internees also, unfortunately a necessary precaution. The news was leaked out. 75 so cleverly that we never knew from what source it came, only that it turned out to be reliable. There were occasional Japanese inspections but the Thai commandant always warned us beforehand, so that anything that might cause trouble or be considered insufficiently austere might be concealed or passed out of the camp. The Thais soon had no more love for the Japanese than we had. Even though there were few outrages, their arrogance was insufferable. The Thai had the bright idea of keeping their one and only submarine safe by anchoring it alongside our camp. Directly opposite us, on the banks of the river, were railway marshalling yards with stocks of rice, rubber and various other commodities, and it was hoped that our presence would safeguard them also, but it didn't work out that way. Thailand had been forced to declare war on Britain and America, and a florid announcement was made that the Allied bases had been pushed too far back to be able to bomb Bangkok. For quite a while it was so, and then the tide turned and fleets of American fortresses began coming over, by night at first and then by day also, when the Japanese fighters no longer dared to go up during a raid. Whether SEATO headquarters knew about our camp or not, they certainly knew about the submarine and marshalling yards. A number of times they came over and set the whole of the opposite bank aflame with incendiaries. The submarine was not hit, but after one or two near misses, it sought shelter elsewhere. After bombing the opposite bank, the huge fortresses would zoom up over our camp, so low that they seemed to be skimming the roofs, their underbellies glowing red from the reflected flames. Several times, when smoke blanketed the river, bombs dropped on our side also. We heard their deep, heavy thud around us. In the daytime we would see 76 them actually leaving the planes and swooping down, always on a trajectory. Twice, bombs fell within the camp precincts, but I was not the only one who preferred the risk of bombs to that of snakes and scorpions. There were many who never went underground. The flimsy modern buildings, with ample door and window space, stood up to the blasts better than more solid structures might have done. I neither gave nor attended any of the numerous classes, but it was in camp that I learned astrology. One of the internees, Leslie, was a lifelong addict and brought a whole trunk full of books in with him. All of Alan Leo and Carter and a number of other books, including a good one on the progressed horoscope, besides bound volumes of periodicals. Making a purposeful break in my non-reading epoch, I went steadily through them, studying and making notes. This took me some months, after which I reverted to my non-reading. There were books circulating in camp, but I did not borrow or read them. Leslie's interest had remained mainly theoretical. He had very seldom actually attempted a horoscope. I, of course, wanted to practice, and under my influence he also began to. We made horoscopes for everyone who wanted them in camp, and a number of internees, pleased with the product, asked for them also for wives or children or others outside. Many people dismiss astrology in the same doctrinaire attitude of mind in which Gwenon dismissed Buddhism. If they were to read through a study in several pages of some person the astrologer did not know, giving his characteristics and aptitudes and the main lines of his destiny, they would see that it could not be lucky guesswork, just as Gwenon would have seen, if he had studied Buddhist texts, that they could not be giving the true teaching by accident, but they are unwilling. 77 Even to consider the evidence, so convinced are they a priori that the movements of planets in the heavens cannot influence the lives of men on earth. Actually, it would be rather a crude definition of astrology which said that they could. The real interpretation is more vast and more profound. That the entire universe is one tremendous harmony, that the same forces are at work in the macrocosm and the microcosm, the cosmos and the individual, that the tendencies in a man and the events in his life flow to the same rhythm as the planetary movements in the skies. That, although the intricacy of the arrangement would make a mathematician's mind reel, no individual can be born except at the moment when the position of the heavens is such as to mirror his nature and destiny. It is a typical misunderstanding which led some people in camp to argue that a man's character is not formed by the positions of the stars at his birth but by heredity. Actually, it is never said that the positions of the stars form a man's character but that they indicate it, and heredity is one of the influences which they indicate. It often happens that several members of a family are born at about the same time of day or have birthdays at about the same date, and both of these are varieties of family likeness which would show in a horoscope, though, of course, by no means the only ones. Leslie and I had an interesting case of family likeness showing in horoscopes. There were two brothers in camp, middle-aged, whose families were outside, evacuated while there was still time. One of them asked me to do his horoscope and the other Leslie. Satisfied with his own, the one who had asked me then asked me to do that of his 10-year-old son, whom I had never seen. I was struck by the fact, although I did not tell him so, that the boy's horoscope showed no likeness to 78 his own. Some days later I saw Leslie working on a horoscope which at once struck me as showing a distinct family likeness to that of the boy. Intrigued, I asked him whose it was, and he told me that it was that of the daughter of the other brother and that it showed no similarity to her father's. I may say that the two brothers themselves were noticeably alike. I then went to them and told them that their two children seemed to have a strong family likeness but not to take after them. Yes, they said, both of them take after our mother, but we don't. When I said that Leslie had previously confined himself mainly to theory, I meant the theory of applied astrology, but there is also a more profound type of theory, the divine or spiritual cosmology writ in the symbols of the stars. Jupiter and Saturn, for example, are the twin forces of expansion and contraction, creation and dissolution of the universe, the day and night of God, the breathing out and in of Brahma. In human life they may show as prosperity and adversity, indulgence and discipline, in caricature as Sir Toby Belch and Malvolio. And on the quest they are the complementary process of expansion and contraction to which I referred in an earlier chapter. I worked out this more essential theory partly from study and partly from my previous knowledge of spiritual cosmology and wrote a book on it which I called The Cosmology of the Stars. After leaving camp and coming to Bhagavan I gave up astrology. I was not sorry to have learned it, but cosmological theory is unnecessary on the direct path, which I was now following, and there was no point in occupying my mind with it. It can, of course, be not merely unnecessary but harmful if one gets too engrossed in it. I have known more than one Hindu, and Hindu astrology concerns itself more with predictions than 79 Western astrology does nowadays, who has dropped it because it was too accurate. Foreknowledge of misfortunes awaiting persons who consulted them caused them so much distress as to destroy their peace of mind. To return to the level of applied astrology, I have nothing against Uranus. Indeed, he can be a very useful ingredient in a horoscope. But they do say that when in conjunction with the moon he is liable to push even an intelligent person into occasional acts of unpredictable folly. I have recorded two such already. The first, my throwing away the chance of an Oxford career, concealed an underlying wisdom. It was not foolish in itself but only in the way it was carried out. The second, my profession of Islam, was foolish both in itself and in the way it was done. Nevertheless, even here there was some underlying grace in it and, if unnecessary at the time, it was soon to become necessary according to the code by which I was living. At the time of my arrest, Uranus scored a third victory, this time with an act of pure unmitigated folly with no grace or wisdom in it at all. I came into camp wearing a turban and long gown and with a string of prayer beads round my neck. It was not exhibitionism. Indeed, I simply estimated that the internment would not last for more than about 3 months and decided to devote the time entirely to prayer, meditation, incantations and reading the Arabic Quran and to hold completely aloof from the profane crowd in the camp. And I dressed to symbolize my decision. Also, I am of a retiring disposition and prefer to remain inconspicuous. Actually, the internment lasted for 3.5 years and I soon changed into normal clothing and, for the first time in my life, did mix with a crowd of ordinary, unpretentious people and found that I liked them. This was a necessary phase in my development. 80 making good what I had failed to do at Oxford, for my refusing to mix there had been due only in part to disappointed idealism, partly also it was a mixture of timidity and conceit. One of the things that struck me most powerfully was their fair-mindedness. I do not refer only to their acceptance of myself as soon as I was prepared to be accepted, though that might well be called magnanimous, but throughout the years of internment it happened a number of times that one person or another would make himself unpopular, and in every case I found that as soon as the cause of disapproval was removed, the camp as a whole spontaneously recognized the fact and, so to speak, welcomed him back into its fellowship. Of course, there were quarrels. It was a very average community and I do not want to make it appear in any way ideal. Some of the women took advantage of being in a minority. Also, there was tension among the camp politicians who aspired to get elected to the committee and run things, but on the whole there was a good spirit. Another thing that struck me was the prevailing dissatisfaction with life, and I do not mean conditions in camp but with life itself, as it had been outside before they were affected by the war. And these people were not misfits or failures. Most of them were at least averagely successful, with a good job, a wife and family, better pay than they would have received at home in England, comfortable house and servants, and a full social life. Yet it was surprising how many would confide that life held no meaning for them and that, while outside, they had drunk heavily in order to forget and not to think. It is dissatisfaction with the false that leads a man to seek the true. When asked why one should seek self-realization, Bhagavan has been known to answer, "Who asked you to? If 81 you are satisfied with your present life, stay as you are." But many people become dissatisfied, and when you realize the self your discontent will vanish. There were also more specific signs of discontent: 3 broken marriages, 4 cases of madness, 1 suicide. A very sociable, good-hearted man, a complete extrovert one would have said, borrowed Paul Brunton's A Search in Secret India from me in order to read about the Maharshi. On giving it back, he said, "Yes, well, when one reads about something like Ramana Maharshi one either does nothing about it, or else." He seemed so unlikely to do anything about it that I said no more to him nor he to me, but soon after the camp broke up, at the end of the war, I heard that he had committed suicide. The most dynamic sign of discontent was that as many as 7 of the internees joined me, pledging their lives to the quest, apart from a number of others who sympathized without deciding to take the plunge. However, before that happened I passed through a lengthy period of dryness and tribulation, a dark night of the soul when I knew the taste of tears, even though with no outer weeping. It no longer seemed a quest that I was making but a vast impersonal process that was taking place, hammering the living being into shape, and with no anesthetic. Suffering seemed the very essence of life and, pain-bearer, the definition of man. I was tempted to despond, to regard God as a tyrant who torments his creatures. There seemed no light, no grace, and no hope of progress, and yet to go back, to renounce the quest, was even more impossible. In fact, the very idea never arose. I just clung on grimly, suffering. The outer conditions of life accorded well with the inner misery but did not cause it, any more than outer conditions cause the unspeakable bliss when grace floods the 82 heart. Indeed, before I left the camp one was to know periods of some grace also, though not at its fullest. There was a lot in me that had to be burned out, and this period of savage pain was largely due to the cauterization. Even at the time I knew this, but that did not make me like it. I did not proselytize. The love of argument was one of the things that had been burned out of me. I preferred to avoid it as far as possible. I still do. Some approached me themselves. Some persuaded each other. This, of course, was proselytism, even though I did not do it myself. Proselytism cannot always be condemned, although it is better to be chary of it. Spiritual understanding places an obligation on a man, and if he has not the endurance and integrity to take this up he is more culpable than before. That is the point of Christ's saying that it was not a sin to be in darkness when there was no light but only to cling to the darkness when light was made available. Therefore the reckless proselytizer may be doing a disservice to those to whom he speaks. That is why initiatic bodies have normally kept their teaching secret, and why Christ warned against casting pearls before swine. Incidentally, this is one of those sayings of Christ's which can have no possible meaning to those who have reduced Christianity to an exoteric shell. What are the pearls and who the swine? And what is there they need fear to reveal? All that they know they proclaim endlessly to whoever will listen. On the other hand, what wonder if those who seek the pearls of wisdom and are given only the exoteric shell find the religion they're taught unsatisfying? Louis Hartz was one who approached me himself. A very conspicuous young man from Holland who, for some reason or other, had not been evacuated with the rest of the Dutch. Short, with black hair and eager eyes, he was obviously seeking. 83 several times he engaged an associate of mine in long discussions but went away unconvinced. Then I saw him walking up and down the camp with an elderly gentleman who had at one time been the head of a school or college and overheard a snatch of their talk as they passed. When I was younger I read the Bible, but of course I don't believe it now. Well, Mr. Hartz, what exactly in the Bible do you not believe? All of it. In view of such a brash reply, it can be imagined that I was not disposed to explain to him at any great length, much less to enter into an argument, when he approached me a day or two later and announced that he wanted to know the truth. I will tell you one truth, I said. Infinity minus x is a contradiction in terms, because by the exclusion of x the first term ceases to be infinite. Yes, he saw that. Very well, then, I told him, think of infinity as God and x as yourself. Now go and think it over and come tomorrow and tell me what you make of it. That was all, no more explanation. When he came back next day he told me that there had been no need to think it over. Before even he got back to his place in the dormitory it had flashed on his heart that it was true. He had been ripe for understanding and therefore a single explanation had been enough. Moreover, it had been the right kind of explanation that I was led to give him because, like my wife, he had the intuitive type of mind which cannot read a whole chapter about what can be said in a sentence. He could. 84 never read Guénon, but he read and reread the Tao Te Ching. However, brilliant initial understanding is no guarantee of a smooth or rapid quest. Since realization is quite different from mental understanding, every preoccupation with the ego is an obstacle to progress on it. The process must continue until the whole nature is transmuted and all egoism dissolved. The internees found various occupations during the daytime. In the evening many of them used to sit around on the lawn in small groups, and ours formed one group among the others. A certain power flowed through me at that time. Sometimes two of the group would discuss some point and decide to ask me about it in the evening, and when evening came I would spontaneously explain it without the question being raised. One person who joined us was of a psychic disposition, and the first time he sat in our evening group he saw a vortex of blue light encircling it and rising to a spiral in the center. In general I had a feeling of how to respond to the needs of the various people, what to say and do. This illustrates the dangers of a false guru. There is nothing personal in such powers. I had never consciously practiced telepathy and I myself never saw any blue lights. Even if I had it would have meant nothing, and yet on the basis of such happenings a man can build up a reputation for himself and start posing as a guru, and if he attributes the power to himself it will be both to his detriment and to that of the people he is supposed to be guiding. Fortunately I was not drawn into any such aberration. Indeed, before the camp broke up I had ceased to exert any influence or to guide the others at all. There was a psychic crisis in camp when one went mad and most of those who had joined me took fright and drew back. That was what was visible. 85 outwardly, but inner events are more fundamental, and in myself I felt at this time a cessation of the power of guidance. I no longer felt that I knew what to do and say. I no longer felt any influence over the others, nor did they any longer feel it. This did not seem to me a privation or a cause for regret, simply a change of course, because the interest in guiding others evaporated together with the power to do so. I vaguely felt it to be a transfer from the spiritual influence of the order into which I had been initiated to that of Bhagavan. More and more I felt his presence and he seemed to dominate and to bestow grace. Although I had only seen him in photographs, his face was more vivid to me, more easily visualized, than any I had ever known. I was content simply to feel his pervading graciousness without occupying my mind at all with what I had been told about his not being a guru. Bhagavan, as I was later to discover, did not encourage people to play the guru, even to the limited extent to which I had been doing so. He would not absolutely forbid it, for that would be doctrinaire. If asked he might say, if it is a man's destiny to be a guru he will be. And he knew that some of his devotees acted so. But on the whole he discouraged it. Even apart from the direct and obvious danger of flattering a man's ego and perhaps inducing him to let himself be regarded as a realized man when he is not, it means a turning of the energy outwards when the aspirant still needs to turn it inwards. If it does not actually put a stop to his further progress, it at least makes it more difficult. And what happened afterwards? Of all those I had known in camp only Hartz was drawn to Bhagavan after the war. For the first year or two he concentrated on building up a business and making money. Then he broke a business trip from Europe. 86 to Thailand to spend a few days at Tiruvannamalai. It was the hot season when I was in the hills with my family. The children were going to a convent school in the hills and we used to spend several months there in the summer, so as to be able to take them out of the boarding house and have them at home with us. I went to Colombo to meet Hartz and we spent the night at the house of K. Ramachandra, a friend who always welcomed devotees of Bhagavan. Next day we flew to Madras and stayed with Dr. T. N. Krishnaswamy, another devotee. The railway journey from there to Tiruvannamalai is roundabout and takes a whole day and night, and the excellent bus service which now plies had not yet been started, so Hartz hired a car for the trip. He was not averse to showing the advantages of being wealthy. Bhagavan was very gracious to him. Indeed, a photograph of Bhagavan taken by him on this trip is evidence enough of the love and encouragement with which Bhagavan regarded him. He received the initiation by look, but, although told by the devotees that this was Bhagavan's mode of initiation, he wanted to make quite sure and therefore said, "I want Bhagavan's initiation." Bhagavan replies, "You have it already. This is the only occasion of which I know when he explicitly confirmed having given initiation." In another way also Hearts desired assurance. He perhaps feared that when he got back into life of the world with all its distractions his steadfastness might weaken. He asked Bhagavan for some guarantee and was given the tremendous assurance, "Even if you let go of Bhagavan, Bhagavan will never let go of you." Once Bhagavan has taken up a person, his destiny becomes more purposeful, is speeded up, so to say. From a worldly point 87 of view, this may be for good or ill. Prosperity may be needed for one man's development, adversity for another. Evidently Hearts was of the latter type, because from this time